In a world where intelligence is judged by credentials, an elite professor challenges a simple cleaning woman to solve an impossible equation, never suspecting she's the mathematical genius who's been anonymously solving the field's greatest unsolved problems while mopping floors to escape academia's politics. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Professor Harrison Powell stood at the front of the prestigious lecture hall, his tweed jacket with leather elbow patches perfectly pressed as he wrote complex equations across the board. He turned to face his advanced mathematics class with an expression of practiced superiority, scanning the rows of eager graduate students who hung on his every word. "And so we arrive at the Riemann hypothesis," he announced, tapping the chalk against the board for emphasis. "One of the most significant unsolved problems in mathematics. Can anyone tell me why this particular problem has eluded even the most brilliant minds for over 160 years? Silence filled the room as students avoided eye contact, frantically flipping through their textbooks. Professor Powell sighed dramatically, making no effort to hide his disappointment. "This is precisely why I question whether some of you belong in this program," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The ability to grasp these concepts. He stopped mid-sentence as his gaze fell upon a woman sitting quietly in the back row. Eleanor Simmons, dressed in simple, modest clothing, appeared to be doodling rather than taking notes. Her appearance stood in stark contrast to the polished academic atmosphere of the hall. "You there in the back?" Professor Powell called out, a smirk playing at his lips. "The custodial staff, I presume? Class doesn't end for another 30 minutes. Perhaps you could enlighten us on the Riemann hypothesis while you wait?" Several students turned to look at Eleanor, snickering behind their hands. She looked up, her expression calm despite the public mockery. "I'm not a custodian, sir," she replied quietly. "I'm auditing the class." Professor Powell's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. "Auditing? My advanced mathematics seminar? How quaint." He gestured toward the chalkboard with a flourish. "Well, since you're here to learn, perhaps you'd like to come down and attempt to solve the equation I've written? It's quite elementary compared to what we usually discuss." Eleanor hesitated, then slowly rose from her seat. She made her way down the steps to the front of the lecture hall, the eyes of every student following her journey. Professor Powell stepped aside, extending the chalk toward her with theatrical courtesy. "Let this be a lesson in humility and proper academic preparation," he announced to the class, not bothering to lower his voice. Eleanor accepted the chalk and stood before the board, studying the complex partial differential equation, one that Professor Powell had been saving as a challenge problem for his graduate students. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her head slightly tilted. Then she began to write. Her hand moved with unexpected confidence and speed across the chalkboard. The snickering gradually died away as students leaned forward in their seats. "Professor." Powell's smug expression slowly transformed into bewilderment as Eleanor filled the board with elegant mathematical notation. Line after line of complex calculations flowed from her chalk. She created an approach that seemed to bypass traditional methods, finding connections between concepts that appeared unrelated. After several minutes of uninterrupted writing, she placed the final symbol, an elegant equals sign followed by a solution. Without a word, Eleanor placed the chalk down and quietly returned to her seat. The classroom remained in stunned silence. Professor Powell stared at the board, his mouth slightly open. The solution was not only correct, but used an innovative approach he had never seen before in his decades of mathematics research. This is correct," Professor Powell finally managed to say, struggling to maintain his composure. "But the method is unorthodox." He turned to face Eleanor, who had returned to her notebook, seemingly unaffected by what had just transpired. "Who are you?" he asked, unable to mask his curiosity. Eleanor looked up from her notebook. Eleanor Simmons. I clean houses for a living. I'm just interested in mathematics. A murmur ran through the classroom as students began to whisper among themselves. One student leaned over to his neighbor, his voice carrying in the quiet room. Wait, isn't she the woman who turned down the Fields Medal last year? Another student responded with wide eyes. No way, that's Eleanor Simmons, the one who solved the Birch and Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture. Professor Powell's face paled as recognition dawned. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the chalk back on the ledge. You're Dr. Eleanor Simmons? The Eleanor Simmons who published the groundbreaking paper on algebraic number theory in the Annals of Mathematics? Eleanor maintained her unassuming demeanor. I prefer just Eleanor, and yes, I published that paper. Later that afternoon, rain tapped against the windows of Professor Powell's office as Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The wall behind him was covered with framed degrees and academic honors. I don't understand, he said, leaning forward across his desk. You're one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of our generation. You could have positions at any university in the world. Why are you cleaning houses and auditing classes instead of leading them? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching the raindrops trace patterns down the window. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, she finally said. My father worked in the coal mines, my mother waited tables. Books were my escape. Mathematics made sense when nothing else did. She adjusted her position slightly, her eyes distant with memory. When I was 12, my math teacher noticed I was different. By 15, I was solving problems that stumped the professors at the local community college. A scholarship brought me to MIT, then Princeton for my PhD. But then you disappeared, Professor Powell said. The academic world has been wondering, what happened to you for years? Eleanor's lips curved into a slight smile. I found that the academic world values prestige over progress. The politics, the positioning, the constant need to prove yourself to people who care more about where you studied than what you discovered. It wasn't for me. She gestured toward the window, to the world beyond. I clean houses during the day. The work is honest, straightforward, no pretense. And at night I do mathematics, pure mathematics, without pressure or expectation. I publish under pseudonyms sometimes just to contribute to the field. But why audit my class? Professor Powell asked, leaning forward. You clearly don't need the instruction. Eleanor's eyes met his, her gaze direct and unflinching. Because I still love learning, Professor Powell. Even from people who think they have nothing to teach me. Her answer hung in the air between them, a gentle rebuke that cut deeper than any harsh criticism could have. Professor Powell looked down at his hands, a man confronting his own arrogance for perhaps the first time. The next day, the lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as Professor Powell stood before his students, a changed man. Eleanor sat in the back row as before, but the students now cast respectful glances in her direction. Before we begin today, Professor Powell announced, his voice lacking its usual pompous tone, I'd like to share something important with all of you. Yesterday, I made a grave error, not in my equations, but in my judgment. I looked at someone and made assumptions based on appearance, background, and station in life. He gestured toward Eleanor. This is Eleanor Simmons. Some of you may know her name from her revolutionary work in several fields of mathematics. Ms. Simmons has kindly agreed to co-teach this class for the remainder of the semester. Excitement rippled through the students. Eleanor looked surprised. This hadn't been part of their conversation the previous day. I have learned perhaps the most important lesson of my career, Professor Powell continued, his voice sincere. Genius doesn't announce itself with fancy degrees or prestigious titles. Sometimes it quietly cleans your house while solving the problems that have stumped you for decades. Eleanor slowly made her way to the front of the class. She stood next to Professor Powell, appearing uncomfortable with the attention, but determined to face it. "Mathematics isn't about who you are or where you come from," she said, addressing the class. "It's about seeing patterns in the chaos, finding truth in abstraction. Anyone can do it if they're taught to see." She picked up the chalk with practiced ease and began writing on the board. "Now, let me show you how I approach the Riemann hypothesis. It's not about finding the solution immediately. It's about asking the right questions." As she began explaining, the students leaned forward, captivated. Professor Powell watched with newfound respect and humility, seeing his subject through fresh eyes. 6 months later, sunshine bathed the courtyard where a small ceremony was taking place. A new sign adorned the mathematics building, the Eleanor Simmons Center for Mathematical Accessibility. Eleanor stood before a diverse group: teenagers from underserved communities, elderly people returning to education, working-class adults, taking time between shifts. Professor Powell stood nearby, his pride evident. "It is my pleasure to officially open the Eleanor Simmons Center for Mathematical Accessibility," announced the university president, beaming at the crowd. "Through Ms. Simmons's vision and Professor Powell's advocacy, this center will provide free mathematical education to anyone with the desire to learn, regardless of background or formal education." Eleanor stepped forward to cut the ribbon, her simple dress replaced by a modest but professional outfit. She still looked uncomfortable with the ceremony, but was visibly moved by the faces of the eager students waiting to enter the center. "Mathematics belongs to everyone," she said, her voice soft but carrying across the courtyard. "It's the language. The universe speaks. Today we're simply opening the door a little wider so more people can join the conversation." She cut the ribbon to enthusiastic applause. Among the crowd were the students from Professor Powell's class, now serving as volunteer tutors for the center's programs. Professor Powell approached Eleanor as the crowd began to move inside. "You've changed this institution, Eleanor," he said, quietly. "You've changed me." Eleanor regarded him thoughtfully. "And you gave me a platform when you could have held on to your pride. That's its own kind of genius, Professor." The afternoon sun highlighted their figures as they walked into the center together. Inside, Eleanor moved among the new students, kneeling beside a young girl from an inner-city neighborhood who was struggling with an equation. "Math isn't about getting the right answer," Eleanor told her gently. "It's about understanding the question. Let's look at this problem together. Shall we?" As the girl's face lit up with sudden comprehension, Professor Powell watched from across the room, understanding that he was witnessing the most profound equation of all, the perfect balance between brilliance and humanity, between knowledge and wisdom. The greatest discoveries he now understood often came from the places and the people you least expected.